feeling, and going hungry was a bad feeling. Probably breaking your leg was a bad feeling, and being healthy was a good feeling. And these may well go before judgments of good and bad based upon aristocratic social structures. But the fact remains that after these initial judgments of pleasure and pain got turned into our judgments of moral value, there is a superimposed layer of aristocratic moral judgments in our culture and in our language. I think that the distinction between noble and base, between noble and mean, between high moral values and low moral values establishes that with a good degree of plausibility. Now, what are we to make of this judgment? What happens when we go beyond good and evil? This is a delicate and difficult question. Nietzsche, in a book called The Antichrist, which he modestly named after himself, one would think, he describes his procedure as philosophizing with a hammer. And that's a very intriguing idea because it shows the destructiveness of his philosophy, the skepticism of it, and the gleeful malice that's in it. And I think it's worth considering the fact that philosophizing with a hammer very easily shades over into intellectual vandalism. And it may be that not everything that can be broken ought to be broken. And it is not entirely clear that the Antichrist offers us more as a moral alternative than the Christian ethics. But his willingness to ask questions about it, I think, is what makes Nietzsche of enduring significance to our culture. For all the madness, for all the evil that's built into it, it's probably the most significant moral development since, the Enlightenment anyway. And in terms of its artistic qualities, I think that Nietzsche is probably in the same league as Plato. And as a great poet-philosopher, Nietzsche and Plato are the two greatest figures who combine art and philosophy. Those of you who have read Nietzsche will know that his critical capacity is awesome, and his artistic capacity is quite great. You would not find that primarily in his poems or in the songs that he writes. Most of the art that he creates directly is quite inferior. But his prose poetry is the greatest in the German language and probably the greatest in the Western tradition. Now, when we finish up with the priest, and we find the liabilities of the priest, when we find that perhaps the priestly type has in fact been selling us a dangerous set of myths, we wonder if we can go back to the warrior. Probably not, except in a sublimated sense. If we were to take the will to power, turn it into something perhaps not as catastrophic as, Aryan war makers or superior brutish types, it may be that the type of the philosopher, that the type of the artist is in fact the warrior type, the individual who needs no moral code to create his own conception of good and bad, that this type is what can come out of a revaluation of all values, and that, I believe, is what is advantageous in Nietzsche. The difficulty is how we will know when we really are beyond good and evil rather than being beneath good and evil. Many of Nietzsche's friends and his philosophical admirers have tried to shield Nietzsche from the criticism that he's a proto-Nazi. And in fact, I don't think it works. I think, in fact, Nietzsche is a proto-Nazi. There's a strong tinge of racism in his work. There is a strong tinge of refined cruelty in his work. And insofar as this was misused in the 20th century by the Nazis and by other racially oriented hate groups, I think Nietzsche is at least in part to blame. Those who like Nietzsche's work, who want to shield him from this criticism, will point out with considerable justification that he would have nothing but contempt for the misuse of his work in this century, but it won't entirely absolve him of the results of his statements, because after all, Nietzsche would have had contempt for everybody, whether they adopt his position or not. So I would say that the warrior type very easily shades over into the barbarian. And Nietzsche, as he puts it beautifully, says, I write in order to be misinterpreted. And if we only have a series of misinterpretations of Nietzsche, because he thinks that there is no one canonical interpretation, well then, it seems to me that he should bear the brunt of responsibility for everything, both good and bad, that comes out of his work. And if we live in a Nietzschean age, it seems to me that we have to find some way of tempering it with whatever it is that is good from the Western intellectual tradition. And if we can't agree as to what we want to call undesirable, whether it's good, whether it's bad or evil, whether it's the master conception of what's undesirable or the slave conception, we may perhaps be able to create a sense of the good which goes beyond the dichotomy between the two, which allows us to create some sort of overlap between them. Perhaps it would be possible, as Nietzsche says, to create an artistic Socrates, a moral Socrates, who is able to both combine the strength of the artist with the mythological capacities of the priest, who is willing to connect his individual judgment with the concern for what is good for the species. And I think Nietzsche himself would not have entirely disagreed with that. If one is going to create a beautiful, artistic philosophy the way Nietzsche does, we have to allow him a certain poetic license. If we are willing to allow Plato's poetry and Plato's myths a certain degree of consideration and a certain degree of leeway for interpretation, perhaps if we did that with Nietzsche, we would come up with a more fertile reading. When you get a chance to read Nietzsche, and of all the philosophers I have taught this in this series of lectures, I strongly and most strongly recommend that you do get a look at Nietzsche. When you do, keep this in mind. Nietzsche has one particular tropy which is characteristic of him, which runs through all his work. And it's analogous to the one tropy which is central to Socrates. If Socrates is the man of inimitable irony, the man who constantly says ironic statements that can be interpreted as the opposite of what he says, Nietzsche's typical tropy is the oxymoron. An oxymoron is something like cold fire or hot ice. It's to use words in the opposite way that they're often, or that they are to be interpreted literally. Nietzschean oxymoron is what makes his poetry so moving. And perhaps the idea that he writes in order to be misinterpreted is that kind of oxymoron. Perhaps the idea that the distinction between good and evil and good and bad is an unbridgeable distinction can also be seen as an oxymoronic construction. Nietzsche's treatment of the warrior, Nietzsche's treatment of the priest, if it's not persuasive historically, and I think as a historian, I think ultimately he's wrong, it is persuasive poetically. And I would ask you to consider the fact that poetic persuasiveness may itself be an oxymoron. Nietzsche believes that having undermined the Western intellectual tradition, by having abolished metaphysics, by having abolished the plausibility of Christianity, what he's done is created a new blank slate for us. And if the slate isn't entirely blank, well, then let's not hold Nietzsche entirely responsible for that. Let's allow for the fact that poetry, and Nietzsche's strong point is the fact that he is a great prose poet, that poetry offers us a multitude of possible interpretations, and that by offering us a liberation from dogma, a liberation from metaphysics, by offering us a kind of poetry which can create new value, which can create new human superiority, which can create a new and finer culture, that Nietzsche has in fact done our culture a great service. However much madness or evil or megalomania is built into the Nietzschean conception of the world, he is surely the greatest philosopher of the last 100 years, and the remainder of the 20th century philosophical tradition would be inconceivable without him. Nietzsche is one of the great forerunners of existentialism. Nietzsche is certainly the first person to articulate the nihilism that threatened our culture as Christianity had to recede after the attack made by modern natural science in the late 19th century. Nietzsche is not, in that respect, the cause of the breakup of Western religion. He's not the cause of the breakup of Western metaphysics. Nietzsche just articulates it. You may think of Nietzsche, to take a poetic figure, as a kind of seismograph. He's the first and most sensitive writer who sees that the continents of our thought are shifting. And rather than causing it, he tells us about it. And in telling us about it, he forces us to confront something that sooner or later we would have to confront. And insofar as he does a lot of the intellectual dirty work for us, insofar as he's willing to be the Antichrist, as he's willing to take upon himself the responsibility for questioning the very foundational elements of our culture, he's one of the greatest thinkers that ever lived. So whatever his liabilities, and I think there are many, because he's an anti-Semite, he's a racist, he's a misogynist. There are many evils in Nietzsche's work. But like it or not, He forces us to think in ways that we would not think otherwise. He forces us to consider closely ourselves and to ask ourselves, how honest are we when we are alone, much less when we are with other people. He asks us not only to have the courage of our convictions. Nietzsche asks, no, he demands that we have the courage to question our convictions, which is a much rarer human quality. Insofar as our convictions will stand up to this kind of critical scrutiny, Nietzsche can be thought of as one of the high points in Western culture. The idea of ruthless self-criticism is quintessentially Greek. Nietzsche wants to bring us back to the earlier, higher, finer conception of human beings, characteristic of the non-Socratic Greeks. If you could think of one particular figure that Nietzsche wishes to supplant in philosophy as opposed to religion, that would be Socrates. Nietzsche is the new Socrates, the Socrates of art, the Socrates of the individual, the Socrates of subjectivity. What he has in common with Socrates is the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. What he has in common with Socrates is a willingness to ask questions about issues that no one feels very comfortable with. And what's more important about Nietzsche is that his answers are intrinsically provisional. Just like Socrates, Nietzsche says everything is always open to question and always will be. Nietzsche calls us not to any dogma, but to a higher and finer kind of life. And insofar as we are heeding that Socratic call, Nietzsche, who would be the anti-Socrates, is in fact part of the Socratic tradition as well. The fact that he is both a Socrates and an anti-Socrates is a perfectly Nietzschean oxymoron.